Hello there and welcome back to The Closet Historian and back to my sewing room for another crafting project. Seeing as you all seem to quite like the last little beaded moth brooch that I made here, this antique gold and turquoise aqua colored little furry moth buddy. That video has done surprisingly well, so I decided to go ahead and dive into another little creature, this time making a cicada. And actually the first beaded insect I ever made was the big black cicada that I made for my cicada gown project, my Victorian costume that I made here on the channel a couple of years ago. So the first beaded bug I ever made was this big black cicada, and I hadn't made another cicada since, which is quite silly seeing as they are one of my favorite insects, and I have a few real ones here in the studio. I actually had one tattooed on the inside of my arm recently, which you can't see here, but I quite like cicadas, so it seemed like a silly thing that I hadn't made any more. And I do want this particular brooch to have a little bit of almost a steampunk sort of influence, and I'll be using a similar color palette to last time, only introducing browns and coppers into the mix. Let's go ahead and jump back in time and over the desk so I can show you how I put this one together. Alright, so I have my materials that I want to use today collected around me, and I've even been kind of mocking up a way to make this little pixelated tiled center for my cicada here, using these square tila beads. Which I do quite like to use when making these bug brooches in general, but I decided to go ahead and use them exclusively for the center of this cicada today, using the tiles almost as like a mosaic to gradate the color so that it has the brightest turquoise in the middle and then fades into the kind of burnished orange color on the outside here. As usual, I will be beading and embroidering onto a piece of felt. This is just a piece of wool blend felt that I picked up on Etsy. You can get craft felt at the like Michael's or Joann's as well, and those work just as well, but I pick up a wool blend felt on Etsy, so I can link the shop where I get these below as well. But I've just sketched on the basic shape of my cicada here. I can refine that as I go around and start working on the embroidery of this. I will go ahead and pad the center just a little bit, just so it's a bit more rounded. So I'm taking a spare piece of burgundy felt here and just cutting it down to size, just so it's a little bit smaller than the center I've drawn here for my cicada, like so. And then I'll put another tiny little piece down the center of this, just again to give this a little bit of padding. And I will just whip stitch this all down around the edge here, just using doubled thread on a long beading needle to do that, but just quickly whipping that down into place so it doesn't move around on me while I go ahead and sew the beads on over this. And I'm going to be sewing all these tila beads on in rows, and then couching those rows down. Someone told me it's not pronounced couching, but that's what I'm going with, I'm sorry. But I will go ahead and just sew the first one of these on. Each of these beads has 2 holes in it, and I will stitch down through both of those holes to secure this on here firmly. I'm just starting with the center because I'm going to have 3 across the top here, and then the next row is 4, and there will be several rows of 4, so you'll see that in a minute. But I'll just secure the top 3 separately here, so going through each side of the bead, just stitching these on like so. Again, I have doubled Gutermann sewing thread on a beading needle here. Again, I get my beading needles at the craft store in the jewelry section. They're nothing fancy, I promise. I'm going to come up through one of the sides of the hole on the center bead here and then thread on a full row of beads. So I'm going to thread on 4 or 5 here, down to the middle of my cicada body. Center of my cicada? Sure. So I'm going to thread on these. I kind of laid out that pattern first so I know what I have to do here. But I'm in the turquoisey section here. These are tila beads that have a Picasso finish on them. It's what they usually call this sort of painted finish on them that gives them a bit of a verdigris or patina look, which I really quite like. But I will take a stitch at the bottom and then come back up the other side of the beads. Again, these beads have 2 holes. I'll show you what I'm doing here. I'm couching down the thread, so if you can see the red lines here, I'm taking stitches over the loose threads between the beads like this and securing it down between each bead like so, so that everything is firmly secured down the center of my cicada buddy. And I will go ahead and do another row the same way right next to this one. You can stagger these in sort of a brick pattern as well. And these tila beads come in, this is a full-size tila here, which is quite small, but is a full-size tila. They come in halves and fourths as well. I think they may go down to an 1/8. No, surely 1/4 is the last. So you can get them in different heights, I guess, as well. So you can really get very pixelated with this if you want to. Although, again, tila are a little bit more expensive, so it's hard to collect a full range of colors of these because they're a little on the pricey side. Hopefully they will become less trendy and therefore will go down in price. But I'm just sewing on more rows of those in the same way. You can create a gradient of color doing this, or you can go ahead and intersperse different colors and different materials. If you see my spider video, I think is where I do a very Klimt-inspired mixing of materials using these tila beads and other things mixed in with them. But I hadn't used these exclusively in this sort of tiled way before, so I wanted to give it a try. And I am using a couple of the smaller narrower beads down here, so I have to switch the way I'm sewing these on, but in general, stitching through both sides of the tela bead and then securing any loose threads down by couching them through the felt. Alright, like so. We have most of our tiling done, at least down one side. I'm going to secure a little red bead on here at the top, a red roundel bead. I think this is a size 4 or 5. I don't know, it was just floating around the sewing room, but I thought some sparkly red eyes would be good for this particular cicada. So I'm just going to go through that bead twice, securing it down to my felt at the top next to the shorter section of beads at the top here. And then I'm just going to use some small seed beads, both size 15s and size 11s. Those are the two sizes of seed beads I use the most in this work in general, and in my sewing room in general. I usually use size 11s. I don't usually go down to the 15. The 15 are tiny, but good for filling small spaces, that's for sure. But I'm just going to thread on some of those to go across the top, and then again I'm going to come up from the bottom of the felt and secure those down by couching them. Same idea, different style of bead basically. You can go in between every single bead or every 2 beads, every 3 beads, whatever you want. It just depends on how much friction you think that area will get. I usually, when it's only like 8 beads like this, I don't mind putting a stitch between each one. When I'm trying to bead a ton on a garment perhaps, maybe I'll go every 3 beads, every 4 beads, if it's not going to receive a lot of tension. But just secure those along the top here. I'm actually going to start a new thread here, so I'm just going to tie this thread off a couple of times, weave it through the felt, and then cut this thread off and start a new one just because this is getting rather short. Just thread that through, and I'll start a new length of thread and sew on the other red eye over here. And then for my wings, I'm just going to outline the top wings here with some French knots. Shocking, I know. I kind of wish I had done this with split stitch. I might do it with split stitch in the future. It's kind of a little bit smoother of a finish, obviously, because these are kind of rough. They look like little seeds next to one another. So here I have 2 strands of rust-colored thread and then 2 strands of brown thread, just variegating the color of my threads, of my embroidery floss that I'm using here. This actually isn't thread, it's embroidery floss, just the regular DMC or DCM or whatever it's called. Cotton embroidery floss that you get in the cross-stitching section at the craft store. But of course you could use any thread that you like. You could use wool thread, you could use silk thread, depends on how fancy you want and what effect you're looking for. But bring the needle up through the fabric, wrap the needle with the threads, put the needle back down through the felt, and kind of hold it tight as you pull it through to secure that little knot. Hopefully that makes any sense. And then the bottom wing here I'm going to fill in with majority of sequins, well, fully with sequins, including these larger, I don't know, like brushed copper colored triangle shaped sequins. So I'm going to use one of those to start here, filling in this little gap between the top wing and the bottom wing. And you can see how I'm securing the sequins on here. Basically I'm bringing the thread up through the felt, through the sequin, through a bead, and then back through the sequin, and that bead kind of holds the sequin in place and onto the surface of the felt. So this is one way I sew sequins on. I'll show you the other way in a moment. I'm going to go ahead and do rows out from this triangle, starting with size 5 brushed brass kind of colored sequins here, like a brushed gold colored sequin, and I'm sewing these on like this, if you can hopefully kind of follow this illustration. I bring the needle up through the felt, thread a sequin on, and then back down through the felt, interspacing these about the width of half a sequin each time. So when I bring the needle up through the felt, I'm bringing it a half sequin's width away from my last stitch. Again, hopefully that makes any sense. So I'm doing these in a row, and then I just change the size of the sequin as I go. So I'm changing the size and color, obviously. You can change just the size or just the color, or you can keep this rows consistent with the same color and size of sequin, whatever you want to do. I just usually like to change things up as I go along. So again, I'm starting with those size 5, I think they are, gold sequins, switching to a size 6 textured turquoise with a gold finish, weird sequin, and then finishing off with a distressed looking blue and green iridescent sequin. It's not exactly easy to explain, see what I'm saying? And the last sequin size, I guess, is a size 8, so probably the largest size of sequin I would use on one of these. It's hard to find good size 10 sequins, which are large. They usually switch up to paillettes, and I'm not really a paillette fan. They're too large. But these size 8 iridescent sequins are some of my favorite sequins I've ever found. I will link to them below. They're so gorgeous. I bought a few extra packages because they're just too delicious and I want to use them for everything. But once I have them all sewn on, I can like flip them to the other way. You know how there's those pillows or dresses where you can flip the sequins up or down? Same sort of idea here. They're sewn on in a similar, well, a mechanical version, but a similar-ish way to this where you can flip the rows to one direction or the other. And those are sequins that are usually one color on one side and one color on the other to give that effect. But these, of course, are the same color on either side. But I'm just filling in this entire little small wing section with alternating rows of those. Again, if the row is shorter, I use less sequins. If the row is longer, I use more sequins. If there ends up with a little gap, I fill it in with a sequin. You know, it's less precise than perhaps you would think. And I never find it very easy to explain these things. And I'm going to go ahead and sew on another copper sequin here on top of this first one. I just took a larger needle and poked through the center of the bottom sequin here so that I could have another hole to sew through here. Worked just fine, but I'm just sewing another triangle one on here just for a little bit more texture and a layered effect. I really like these triangle sequins. They're so gorgeous. Again, these are from Idea to Sequins, which is a shop based in India that I found on Etsy that has the coolest different sort of sequins, and so I've placed a couple of orders with them. They do take about 6 weeks to 12 weeks to get here from India all the way to the United States, but it's worth the wait for the really unique, cool sequins, I think. Now, I had these peacock sword feathers sitting around, and I thought, I wonder if I could incorporate some of these feathers into this piece, because the colors would work quite well, the sort of teal and green colors of the peacock feathers. But I'm going to go ahead and use long and short stitch to fill in the section that I want to put the feathers on first, just so that none of the gray of the felt peeks through. I want to have like teal underneath those feathers so that they can blend into the teal as opposed to having peaks of felt show. So I'm just taking longer stitches here, and then I will take in short stitches in between them and kind of fill this in. It's like half satin stitch, half long and short stitch. I'm using the full 6 strands of embroidery thread on my needle here. I mean, I'm not doing this super, super fine thread painting like you would with long and short stitch when you were changing colors and things like that, because it's going to be covered with feathers in a minute. So just filling this whole area in here with this lovely teal green color cotton thread. I would love to invest in some silk threads, but it is quite an investment. Now I'm going to take a different color of oxidized copper sequin here. This is like a blackened copper triangle sequin, again from Idea to Sequins. And I'm going to secure that on to the top wing here in the same way that I did on the bottom one, just using little seed beads at the corners, like little rivets to hold it on. I thought that gave it a nice touch instead of just stitching them on. And then I'm figuring out how I want to lay the sections of feather down here. I'm peeling a little bit of the threads of the feather off the main stem of the feather. I do not know the technical names for these things, that's right. But I'll just maneuver that until I like how it looks, kind of lining it up with the threads here is what I want to do. And then I'm going to bring the needle up through the project and just secure over 1 or 2, taking little vertical stitches like this. I think this is like brick stitch pattern or something like that. I can't remember, basket stitch. I don't remember all the names of the stitches. I just do what I need to in any given moment, you know. I'm free-handed it. I'm not thinking much when I'm doing these things. I'm just, again, painting, but with beads and sequins as opposed to with paint in this case. So I'm just securing that down by switching and alternating different rows of feather and taking little tiny stitches. I'm actually using brown thread for this. I could have switched to a turquoise thread if I had gotten up and grabbed some, but it's fine. In the end, it blends in well enough. I'm taking pretty tiny stitches over this, so just securing these down anywhere they want to flip up or move around, but not so much that the iridescence of the peacock feather is covered, of course, because that's what we're here for. The very fun, actual mechanical iridescence of a peacock feather, which is what insects use as well, mechanical iridescence. As previously stated in these videos, the shape of the scales on the ectoskeleton and on the wings of different Lepidoptera, and I don't even know what cicada are. What family are cicada in? I'll have to look that up. They probably have their own family. I bet you they're Cicadae, or like the Latin version of cicada, if I had to guess. But they also have mechanical iridescence using their scales, so it's not necessarily because of the pigment of the scales that they look iridescent. It is because the actual physical structure of the scales look iridescent, as previously discussed in my bug making videos. One day I'll make something that isn't a bug. I have some sequins that are absolutely perfect for making a rainbow fish, like the children's book Rainbow Fish, so I really need to make one of those. But actually just angelfish in general would be quite fun, or even starfish would be quite fun, or pieces of coral would be quite fun. So I will expand out into sea creatures, I think, soon. But just using more of that same peacock feather, securing those strands down, and then to add a little bit of sparkle into this area, because although it's iridescent, it is quite matte compared to the rest of this. I'm going to just add on a couple of bugle beads. Yes, I couldn't remember the word bugle bead last time. For some reason, my brain was blanking on it. Some of these iridescent gold, bronzy colored bugle beads just sprinkled in here to catch a little bit of light as we transition into the more shiny sequins for the end of my wings. And again, I'll be doing the same thing I just did on the bottom wings with this top, switching from small sequins out to large sequins at the end. And this time I'm using mostly brushed copper colored sequins and then shiny copper colored sequins. And then the final size 8 sequin here is a printed sequin. It's like a printed holographic sequin. Again, there's some wild, awesome sequins out there. You can find patterned sequins. I have galaxy print sequins in my stash. Pretty awesome. You can find polka dot or camouflage or striped sequins. There's a lot of really random things out there. So I like, again, mixing the textures and finishes of the sequin. So I'm starting with a size 5 copper sequin in a matte satin finish, switching to a size 6 shiny copper sequin, and then finishing off with these printed shiny sequins in gold and blue and red and copper, kind of switching the finish completely on that one. But of course, I really like the iridescent effect that this provides. You can really see on the bottom wing that blue-green yet gray distressed sequin. It's just the best thing ever. But yes, I'll start a new thread here and sew on a couple more rows just to finish off this top wing on this side. Sequining like this actually doesn't take too long. It's not too bad. I find it really fun to do these little rows of sequins, especially when you get to gradate them like this and kind of create a gradient of color and effect, which I think is fun. And again, if there's any little gaps I see or need another row somewhere, I can just slip those in there. It's a very forgiving process, I suppose. And like doing the sequins layered like this in sort of a scale-like pattern, really you can just like slip a few extra ones in there if you need to, or maneuver things around to be the shape you want. In this case, a little slightly pointy cicada wing. Now I'm going to be doing the same exact stuff that I did on that one side of the cicada to the other side here, including, once again, sewing on our copper triangle plate little piece of armor here next to the body. And then again, I will use the rest of that peacock feather. I had these peacock feathers just sitting in my stash. I actually reorganized my sewing room. I think I have about, I have like 1/5 of the way left to go. So I'm almost done reorganizing my sewing room. I really just needed to clean, like reorganize all my fabric, reorganize my sequins, give this whole place a clean. I updated the gallery wall with a couple of prints that I picked up while I was in London. So let me know if you want to see a new sewing room tour. Not a ton has changed, but I could go ahead and do a new tour of the studio down here if that's something you would like to see. Show you my sequin organization, and maybe we can take a peek into my stash. It would be interesting. I'll have to see if there's such a thing as like a fabric stash tour tag, because there's like so much fabric I can't go through all of it, but it'd be interesting to be like fabric you bought longest ago, or like something that's been the stash the longest, or something that was like the most expensive thing in your stash or the cheapest thing in your stash. So like we could highlight a couple of particular things as opposed to having to go through all of it, because it's too much to do that, I'm afraid. We have a serious problem. I need to not buy any more fabric for a very long time, especially after London, where fabric, again, was quite pricey, and therefore I don't need to buy fabric for a very long time. But once I had replicated everything I did in the first side of the cicada onto the other side of the cicada using the exact same techniques, I decided to fill in the bottom of the like tail of the cicada here. Of course, these beads are very square, so they don't you can only round the edge so much. So I'm deciding to fill in the rest to create the little semi-rounded end of the cicada with tiny size 15 seed beads. So I just did that and couched those down. But then I'm going to cut tabs all the way around here. Be careful not to cut into your stitches, obviously, or into the sequins themselves. And then I can fold all these felt tabs to the inside and finish them off. I think this is how I usually do the beetles, and actually usually the moths too. But it's better for puffier designs. I think for this cicada, I probably should have just cut around the edge and then layered the backing material in and made sure to secure the edges with backstitch, or not backstitch, blanket stitch, extra close together, which is how I think I did the black one. So I'm doing this the way I've been doing it for the other bugs, but for the cicadas, I think to keep them a little bit flatter, it's nicer just to trim around the edge, again, making sure not to get in your stitches, instead of folding all the tabs in like this, to just cut it smooth. Hopefully this makes any sense. Again, you can watch me make that original black cicada in that video as well. So I will put a card up to that video where I make the original all black cicada, which I think is quite fun. Of course, I like different textures of black. No one is surprised there. But yeah, I'm just molding the felt to do what I want, folding everything to the underside of this buddy, kind of pinning things in place, and then roughly Frankenstein stitching everything into place here. Yes, I have this at a billion times speed. It does take kind of a long time to do this bit. It's not the pretty part. It all gets covered up later, so I don't worry about it being pretty stitches. I just worry about it being structurally sound. I'm just going to cut a piece of wire to use here to make our antennas for this one. Because the wings are open and block the legs, I don't worry about putting legs on the cicadas with the open wings like this. But we do need their tiny little antenna because cicadas have cute, short little antenna, and I think they're adorable. So I'm just going to turn the edge of this wire. Most of this is not in super good focus. I'm so sorry about that. I'm always trying to refine how the heck I can film these because I get lost in the work and forget to like refocus the camera or to see if I'm still in shot and things like that. It's like when I try and film makeup videos, which is a nightmare. I'm always like leaning out of the camera to do my eyeliner. Same problem I have here where I don't notice that I've gone off camera. But I'm just turning the end of this piece of wire, threading on some of those size 15 seed beads again, and then this is how I fold the wire. So I have these little long loops that are very narrow, and then I just pinch them shut to create this kind of like weird T-bar or like H-shaped formation that I can then secure the beads in place and then sew on this little piece of wire to the back of my cicada buddy or moth or whatever I'm making, depending on what needs antenna that day. I get the question sometimes if I make these like accurate, which I don't. These are all fantasy bugs. There's only the moth, the first moth I made was I ever trying to actually replicate an actual bug. The rest of the time I'm just winging it. I don't really look at images of bugs for reference or anything, every once in a while, but I kind of just make up what I want. But to add stability to the inside of this, I'm using a very messy little weird piece of copper wire, as you can see, just so that I can bend the wings towards my body just a little bit when I'm wearing this, and so it doesn't flop away from the garment. It like bends a little bit towards me, just keeps its shape a little bit better. And then I'm going to use a piece of hat making buckram, which is a cotton or paper or cotton and paper blend, like stiff net that has been stiffened with a sizing, so like a glue, probably something that's like natural, like think of like cornstarch or something like that, like a sizing starch is in this, just to give this little bit of stability in the back. This is how I usually finish off, how I finished my moth last time as well. And I will stitch my pin back on at this point, and I'll stitch all the way through to the other side of the brooch, just to make sure this is really secured on here. Again, I don't like using glue for this, just because good glues take a while to dry, and hot glue is very heavy, so I don't like how heavy and bulky it is. So I prefer to just stitch these on, and I do stitch them all the way through to the outside. The stitches will be hidden underneath beads and sequins anyhow, so it's no big deal. And then for my final backing on this, I am going to cover all my messy stitches up with a piece of rust-colored felt this time. I'm marking where the pin back edges are so I can cut little slits in this felt and poke the pin back mechanism through the felt so that only the mechanism, like the catch and the pin of the pin back show, and the rest of it is hidden underneath this felt as well. You can, of course, use leather or pleather or other materials for this final backing. I just prefer to use felt. Again, I think it has a little bit of friction and stickiness to it, so it helps the bug stay in place on whatever I've pinned it to, usually my shoulder or something like that, like my chest, because I'm usually wearing these as brooches, but you can, of course, pin them on a hat, pin them on a costume, pin them on a handbag, wherever you want. Onto a Christmas tree. I do want to make a bunch of these as Christmas ornaments for a bug-themed tree in my future. One day, when I have a house to decorate, I'll have a lot of fun with that. But I just go ahead and I'd use a blanket stitch all the way around the edge of this to finish this off. And that will actually be my final step for this cicada brooch today, and I look forward to making some more in the future. And here is my finished aqua and turquoise and bronze and coppery tones, a little bit of that antique bronze in here as well, and a little bit of iridescence, of course, with the different sequins, and then the peacock feathers, of course, adding some iridescence onto this as well, and a little bit of a different texture. That's one of the things I really like to do with these, is mix textures. So I have shiny metallic sequins, I have the sort of matte yet iridescent texture of the peacock feathers in here. Some of the sequins have a satin finish, some of them have an iridescent finish, some of them are just plain metallic. So it gives a very different textured effect, instead of having everything be the same texture. I kind of like to gradate not only the colors and shades, but also the textures of the materials I put together for these. But I hope you enjoyed seeing how this one came together today, and thank you for your support on these types of videos. I really enjoy making these things, so it's nice that the last video did pretty well, so I could go ahead and dive into making another. And thank you as always for watching today. I'll be back with more sewing, vintage fashion, costuming, and crafting real soon, so I'll see you then. Bye!